Rob Joyce's bio is available at the Symposium website, and you can read to get the details. I'll just share as a personal observation. I first met Rob over a decade ago when he was working just as an engineer, and was introduced to him as somebody that I should get to know because he was going places. Well, he has gone quite a few places. He has worked not only on offense and defense sides of very hard problems for the national interest through the National Security Agency, but he served time at the White House on as an advisor on cybersecurity to the president, and he's also spent time in London as a liaison to the British. Now he's back at the NSA as the director of the Cybersecurity Division, one of the major divisions inside the National Security Agency. So Rob has had experience in a number of realms, and this is something that we try to emphasize here at CERIAS, is that cybersecurity is not simply the technology. It is not simply finding bugs in code or how to exploit them or defend against them. It involves more. And Rob's a perfect example of that, as someone who's been involved in national policy and advising our leaders as to best investments and best ways to do defense, and working as a liaison to our allies in another country. Because many of the threats we face are global. If you listen to Senator Lugar's remarks yesterday, you heard him talk about how we have to have an international alliance, some diplomatic initiatives to deal with some of the most critical issues, such as the rise in ransomware. So with all of that said, we encourage our students, we encourage those listening in to think about cybersecurity more expansively, to be more than simply the computing technology, but to encompass issues of communication, of political science, of ethics, of psychology, of linguistics, and a number of other disciplines, all of which employ computing and the use and misuse of computing as central to what they do. We'll just turn it over to him.
All right. Thanks, Beth. I'm pleased to be here, and I appreciate the flexibility on the schedules and being able to work with us here. So I wanted to start first with a little vignette of where NSA is in the big federal food chain of the cybersecurity agencies. We have a foreign intelligence responsibility and a cybersecurity responsibility, and in that cybersecurity space, we're charged with protecting national security systems. Those are the things that carry and communicate classified information as well as warfighting information. So as you can imagine, that is the penultimate set of secrets that the US government wants to protect. And so for a number of years, we've relied on the code making capabilities of NSA as the last line of defense in cybersecurity. We've got to have trust and confidence that the codes we're making are unassailable. But what we've learned from our SIGINT side of the business is that you can have great codes and still lose your information. And we will go to great lengths to cheat in that world and go get the information we need. And so you can catch things before or after they're decrypted. You can introduce subtle flaws. You can find ways around what is abjectly, theoretically perfect encryption and still get to the underlying information in the larger system. And so that's what, to me, makes all of this fascinating. And the decades of code making and code breaking at NSA give us an appreciation for how you go about protecting your information. I myself have been on both sides of that mission, having led the hacking activities at NSA and then being a couple times in the defensive side. And what it does, what we're finding is you just think differently when you play both offense and defense. it calibrates you to the types of things that are reasonable and practical, and highlights some of the, the almost the movie script hacking scenarios that often people will spend a lot of money on protecting, but don't actually provide a whole lot of extra protections. So over the years, I think that's been the two capabilities NSA has brought to bear in the cybersecurity world. One is that practical experience. It takes a thief to catch a thief, informing just how we would go about penetrating a system, defeating a protection, overcoming some sort of defense. And then the second is the foreign intelligence mission, which is the ability to reach out into our adversary space and understand what they're doing, what they're trying, how they're succeeding, or even how they're orchestrated in their campaigns to come against the US and the things that matter to us. So it's a fascinating space. And the last couple years, the last year in particular, have been a watershed type of moment where we've gotten much better at working in the operational space with industry. And I think the important thing to recognize is decades ago when NSA stood up, we were protecting government networks that were designed and built for the government. And where we are today in 2021 is we are protecting networks that really use the same commercial technology that Fortune 100 companies use, that our Defense Department uses, that our White House uses. They're commercial switches and firewalls and operating systems and intrusion detection systems, and all of that are commodity items, both in the government, in our adversaries, in industry. And so we're making a big effort to connect with industry to figure out how we defend these things, right? We're trying to do that to defend those national security systems. We're trying to do that to defend the defense industrial base, where the Department of Defense has special equities in trying to make sure that the weapon systems being designed and built and fielded are secure and capable of standing up in an environment where they will be under cyber contest. They will have adversaries come at them. And we've had some eureka moments. Shouldn't surprise you that what we found is that knowing something is of no use if you don't do something. And I think that's where our exquisite classified insights for the government have paid dividends for years, but we've really not figured out the secret sauce to get those over and work with industry. We've been prototyping in the last 9-ish, 10 months, the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center here at NSA, where we've brought virtually, in most cases, industry and NSA together for those big defense industrial based companies, for their cloud providers and their service providers. And we've started talking to them about the threats and tradecraft we see in adversary space. As I mentioned, that's our superpower, right? That's what we bring to the table. They come to the table having tremendous insights into their own networks, the attacks that are touching them personally, and the technologies that they manage and operate. So when we talk to a cloud provider or an ISP that's protecting one of the big name brand defense industries, what we're finding is when we teach them about Russian tradecraft and they're able to look in their networks for the examples of that malicious activity, and then they come up with countermeasures and protections that drive that tradecraft out. They've not only protected that defense company or that government entity that's a customer, but it applies broadly across all of the elements that they service. So we're really focused on this idea that over time, the advantage absolutely is with the offense, right? That they get to come at you over and over again, and they keep trying until they succeed. And what we realize and recognize is that's not a great set of odds for the defense if you're just sitting there and the analogy is the hockey goalie sitting out at mid-ice who's got an infinite number of pucks and just has to keep sending those slap shots one after another until they get one into the net. And you can be an amazing goalie, and if you're 99.99% accurate, that's great. But if they send enough pucks your way, some are going to get through eventually. So we really have focused on some efforts to induce, I'd call it sand and friction into the space. You will never be perfect, but we shouldn't allow them to sit at center ice and hit goal after goal at you. So there's a wide array of things we can do there. We have no authorities at NSA to go ahead and enact those opposition events. But we're here co-located with our partners at US Cyber Command, who have military authorities to do offensive cyber operations. And so we work with them on things they can do to go and disrupt and deny the capabilities that would come at us. But there's a whole host of other things that go into that file of sand and friction disruption. It's the things like working with law enforcement who do indictments and arrests. But there are safe havens, and you're not going to arrest your way out of the cybersecurity problem. So we work with Treasury to go after the money. We work with State Department to go after the safe havens and the countries that harbor some of this malicious activities. And then we're also able to work publicly, whether it's with those infrastructure providers or just the cybersecurity community and industry at large, to highlight the tools, tradecraft, and infrastructure that are bringing these attacks. And if we can take away tools and infrastructure and introduce that friction, it goes a long way to slowing the rate of shots coming in. And I think that's an important thing. So you'll hear the US government, National Cyber Director Chris Inglis talking about the concept that to beat one of us, you have to beat all of us. And that's a major push right now, is lashing together all our unique capabilities. Whether it is the authorities of NSA to look into that foreign intelligence space, CISA to communicate and convene with industry, FBI for law enforcement disruption things, Treasury to chase the profits and the cryptocurrency and the things that make cybercrime beneficial, to bring those together in a coherent way, but also bring industry, because right now 85% of the critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private entities. So we need them. And we also need them because FBI and NSA just don't get to see the domestic angle of the infrastructure. And the adversaries have learned that, and they will tunnel through and rent and co-opt servers in the US to pop out at that point and then launch attacks from inside the fence line to try to maneuver. So as we see them practice and develop tools and tradecraft overseas, as we see the intent and the focus on targets, or we see the operations being run, that's the end we can see. We need to connect that with the networks that are receiving the other end of those packets, who have much more granularity and fidelity on the things touching them, and maybe even a lot of dark space that we can't and shouldn't see. And we come together to talk about, especially at that level where we look at the capabilities, the intent, the tradecraft, rather than any single IP address that may be bad and ephemeral. But overall, linking the conversation between people who have data and analytics and the analysis of what is the current ongoing threat, that's yielded some really incredible, amazing outcomes. So from there, I'll pivot a little bit and talk about, what do we need as a nation? There's a series of things that, I think about on a daily basis. One is the pipeline, right? So, Purdue, SPAF, the educational institutions that are developing and bringing up our next generation. That starts from the earliest levels of education to get kids interested in technology and the cybersecurity or cyber landscape writ large, to see themselves in all sorts of diversity, to be able to join and have an interesting, exciting career out there, right? How cool is it to be able to go and chase the Russian intel service as they try to burrow and dig into the U.S. energy sector, right? That's an awesome opportunity, and I'm not sure that a fifth grader sitting in the Midwest is always going to appreciate that that's really an opportunity. And you don't have to be deeply immersed in amazingly hard classes to start on that journey. In the end, it's creativity, ingenuity, interest, and excitement that will get you open and in the door. And I've watched tons and tons of people at NSA, and it isn't always the intellectual heft that succeeds. It is really that curiosity and diversity of thought and the capabilities to just be dogged and think differently and pursue the creative approaches to defending and disrupting. So, I'm passionate about how we develop that next generation of talent. Some of those are heavily educated, academic focused to think big thoughts and figure out how we're going to break the chain and cycle of cybersecurity. Others are practitioners who are going to come in and just do amazing things. I mentioned, history in hacking at NSA. At the time I was leading that organization, one of our best operators, the hacker who we would turn to day in, day out when we had the hardest challenge, he was a Navy machinist mate who had been cross-trained to do cyber operations. And just the creativity and passion that they brought wound up making them the most successful person we could turn to. So it is across the gamut of those. And Jen Easterly, the director of CISA, likes to say that we really need an engagement strategy that starts talking about cyber from K to gray, right? Everybody sees themselves in that environment, whether it's staying safe personally for you or your family, or whether it's being inspired to go into a career that's going to advance this field. So all sorts of cool stuff. So that's one thing I think about. That second thing I talked about is that connection, so that we bring everybody to the table and at a practitioner level. It's no good when NSA hands information to a company's corporate representative who has the government account. We need to be talking cyber analyst to cyber analyst, and you don't need the guys with suits in between, because that doesn't happen at the speed of cyber. It doesn't bring us the outcomes. But where we take technical people with digital dirt, digital bits under their fingernails, into that same virtual environment, and they share and collaborate on what may be interesting, exciting things that industry sees but doesn't understand, and then we can pull the thread out into the foreign space. The magic happens. So it's pretty cool. So that's number two. Third area that I'm thinking about a lot is, what does good defense look like? And you'll hear the hot topic these days is zero trust. And I'm absolutely all for the concepts of zero trust, where you really trust and authenticate at every step, verify trust and authenticate at every step of interactions. So everything is tagged, labeled, and we have exceptional logging, and then people using that information to verify good things are happening and reasonable things are happening. But that trust and verify for each and every step, where you presume from the beginning that you have an untrusted actor, and you have to move from that state to a verified trusted capability is really vital. And so there's a lot of work from industry up through academia of how do you implement that and do it robustly. But let me give you a frame on that. It's not the panacea. It is certainly a better paradigm for how we set up, configure, and manage our activities. But consider this. Last weekend was the Tianfu Cup in China. That was a competition, an open public competition, where researchers were challenged to find vulnerabilities in major commercial technologies, everything from Windows to iPhones to Linux operating systems to routers. And in the broadest cases, those were all Western developed, Western focused technologies that the world uses. In total, those software and devices were all popped. There was wild success in finding exploitable vulnerabilities, code execution, remote code execution, and privilege escalations across a number of our latest software technologies, all patched and updated, right? So what does that tell me? That says that no matter how much we preach patch, 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 and that is absolutely an industry best practice, that you need to be running the latest software improvements and defenses that that everyone can offer. When there's an upgrade and update, pick it up and adopt it, because if there's known vulnerabilities, they will be found and exploited at an increasingly effective rate. The fact that we could take all of these systems that we rely on in trust, and they could find holes in each and every one of those systems, means that we've got to assume going forward that we're always going to have vulnerabilities in the systems we're fielding. That adversaries, at least the highest end adversaries, maybe not pedestrian criminal activities, but those nation state activities going after our critical infrastructure and national security systems, our weapons systems, they're going to find flaws in the security net around them. So then the question is, what does it mean if my authentication system has a flaw, right? Am I set up to detect, defend, eradicate after that compromise occurs? And I think that's an excellent area for both academic research and practical architectures. There's things we can do today in that zero trust world that are architected to drive down the impact, to improve the resiliency after somebody succeeds in finding one of those flaws. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done so that we generically have architectures that are resilient, that help us detect when there's anomalous effects, and then to get back to a state where we trust the security of that system or network. So all interesting things. The other thing I would really like to kind of pound on the table about is these flaws and vulnerabilities often are there latent to be found because we haven't used the best practices for software development and the standards and tools and techniques that are available in modern software development practices to write secure code. So there are absolutely better choices for coding languages. There are tools that will statically analyze the software being produced and identify common flaws that lead to exploitable vulnerabilities. And then there are architectural designs that we should be employing that, again, ensure that we drive down whole classes of known bugs. And I'd love to see universities writ large pick up the requirement to have that taught to every computer science student that's coming through the pipeline, that they understand where the sources of flaws are, what the best current techniques and technologies are for writing secure software, and they're able to apply that. So we're working, trying to drive that into curriculums. We're working to talk to industry to make that a part of their job advertisements, so that, again, we create that demand signal and feedback loop that then pulls from industry that they want to write secure software, and drives back into the educational pipeline saying that's important. So students both take it in an elective or even a mandatory requirement for their ability to get through and out of school. So I'll end with one quick set of thoughts about the way we frame up doing cyber defense today. For me, it starts with hardening your architecture. It's very clear that there are better choices to be made and proper ways to architect a defensible network right now. So it starts with those core principles, and I think often the choice to harden is not one of should I harden, but it's almost a financial decision. Will we be able to invest in doing the right things that we know we should be doing? Do we employ enough resources and knowledgeable people to harden our systems? The second thing we need to do is we need to actively defend those systems. And by that, I mean simple things like, do you have logging enabled, and do you have a team that's paying attention to those logs to go ahead and defend inside that space? Then the third area is counter. Do we have the ability to go out and stop that hockey player from shooting all the pucks at us? And that's the thing I think you see the government working on, to try to defend forward and contest the adversary's ability to just have those free shots on goal, right? And then the fourth thing we're trying to figure out is, how do we scale? Because if you look between the biggest companies who have the most resources and the teams to do this, some of them are doing it exceptionally well. And then you go down to the newest startup, and when you're scrapping and fighting for your life in a small company, the place you're not going to invest is having a 5-person cybersecurity team. So what do we do for the people on both ends of that spectrum to make the ecosystem and environment safe at scale? So thank you for letting me rant and ramble for a bit. I think we're going to open up for a few questions for a while. So Gene, back over to you to moderate for a bit.
Thank you, Rob. I greatly appreciate your comments. We do have a couple questions here, and let me remind the audience, if you would like to ask a question, please post it into the Q&A section on Zoom. There are two good questions here that relate to what you were saying. One is, what are the most common pitfalls writing code that make it vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks? You were talking about software security, so that's a direct lead-in. So to comment on that.
Yeah, so I think there's a series of memory-safe languages that we ought to be adopting. If you look at the C and C++ world, you can do horrendous things accidentally if you don't know good coding practices, right? So just moving to that next generation of memory-safe languages is a huge benefit. And then the code auditing tools. The lawyers at the government won't let me name favorites, right? But there's some industry leaders that just have the ability to look at your code and highlight when you've made a well-known mistake. And so every software development practice needs to make that a part of their routine, where there's both static and dynamic analysis tools reviewing the code for safety.
Okay, Thank you. Let's see here. Any discussion about the data breach disclosure law changes that are pending in front of Congress, for instance, making it mandatory to report above a certain size or believed to be from certain sources?
Yeah, I won't express opinions, but I can give you a little bit of background on the whys from both ends, right? From the government end and the corporate end, so that hopefully folks understand the dynamic of the discussion a bit more. So it's the case where today we have intrusions into big companies and critical infrastructure on a continuous basis, and some of that is opportunistic. That's the equivalent of the thief who walks through, suburban neighborhood, checking all the car doors at night. And if they find something unlocked, rummaging through there and finding things that probably shouldn't be in the car overnight anyways, right? You hear about neighbors losing handbags and laptops and even wallets, simply because, one, they left valuables in a place they probably shouldn't be, and two, they weren't locked. So the question is, can we illuminate those activities at scale and drive those down? And there's a belief that breach notification will assist in classes of bulk scanning, bulk exploitation, opportunistic things being illuminated for the betterment of those around the people who were victims, or even for the better defended people who notice that activity going on to be able to inform and then get that message out. And the desire in this congressional proposal is that CISA be the recipient of these breach notifications so that then they can better inform about the other victims that potentially either are exploited that don't know it or would be next in line. And we think that's even more important when you start getting to the nation state level, where the tradecraft and sophistication may be even more focused in peers and like industries. So on the commercial side, generally, the companies are interested in participating and helping out the community cybersecurity. But what they worry about is that information affecting them in a business sense, whether it be impacting their stock price because now there's notification that they have been impacted, whether it's the potential for lawsuits because their shareholders say, look, you didn't do your cybersecurity appropriately, and we think you as corporate officers ought to be liable for that stock price drop after you were hacked. Or the idea that by telling one government agency that information will flow over into the regulators for their critical infrastructure sector. And they may see regulatory fines or punitive action because their information has come out. And then finally, the idea of competitive advantage. Will their competitors be able to see or understand anything going on in their business because it was put out? Overall, I think Congress is to the point where they believe they can manage those corporate concerns, and the greater good for the information sharing is going to happen. With my SIGINT hat on, I'm thinking about, boy, if you build this big database of all the places that are known hacked, that is a place the adversaries are going to want to be, and to understand where they've been seen, caught, or succeeded. And so that's going to be a focus of ours is, all right, if we build it and they come, how do we defend that as well? Because it will be certainly an interesting, exciting place for those adversaries.
So that sort of leads into another question, and I'm going to editorialize a little bit on it. For decades now, we have been trying to tell people in industry and in government to apply some of those basic principles that you mentioned, and that have been reinvented under the name Zero Trust and others. Things like complete mediation, minimization, and lack of commonality, and so on. But it's been a very tough sell because it costs money, it requires discipline. Many businesses don't want to spend the money or apply the discipline. Many government agencies, whoever's leading them, isn't there long enough to feel the consequences. You mentioned a few possible pressures back, such as shareholder suits or regulatory, but the vast majority of organizations aren't subject to those in the country. So are there other ways that we can incentivize organizations to pursue these protections, especially if the majority of them aren't being hacked and don't see the problems, so they feel that they've misspent their resources?
Yeah. So Spaff, I blame you. If you had been, if you had been a better salesman 25 years ago and people listened to you, none of this would be happening today. No, but I tease because, it really is the case that we have had a lot of these answers for decades, and it is the financial, social component of it that we've not cracked the nut on. There's a series of pressures that I think are trying to be applied. One certainly is the ransomware world has just changed the narrative in the environment. It is the case that the quantities of companies that are being impacted by ransomware are reaching the level that boards are finding it an existential threat, both to their own personal liability and the survival of the company. And so I am impressed with the number of big companies that are bringing cybersecurity expertise onto the boards, asking the hard questions, getting a voice in where those investments are being made. So that certainly is one aspect of change. The second, though, is I think that congressional component that you referenced. I look at where we were, and this has been used and reused many times, but the idea of the automotive industry, we would not have anti-lock brakes, airbags, and emission controls had it been only up to industry. And I think there's a series of things we need to have industry do that they won't do on their own, but we have to do through law, regulation, and other levers. So I say that looking at the everything from cloud security today. If you go out and spin up an AWS instance with the default configurations, those are not the most secure configurations and do not have the best known protections built in. How do we set the defaults? That's the thing that's going to improve the ecosystem. Is we've got to have the defaults by design set to secure standards. And there's business pressures of sometimes it's harder, sometimes there's more friction, sometimes it breaks backward compatibility, right? So there's some headwinds to making those changes, but I truly believe that to improve the ecosystem, we've got to drive to some of those things. That it really takes effort to not use a two-factor authentication in a new account, right? That it's allowed, but you really ought to be questioned and careful about how easy it is to set it up in an insecure way. Same thing for the way you expose your data, the way you authenticate on. There's a whole raft of things that we need to dial up. And then finally, I think there's things in the ecosystem, as I mentioned, that educational component to where people understand the right way to think and operate in this complex environment. You aren't born knowing it. You've got to be taught and trained, and getting it to the point where everybody is exposed to it and taught the right and wrong ways to do things, whether it's coding and development or simply being a native in the digital environment. All of that ought to be parts of our curriculum, starting at the earliest levels all the way up through.
So I'll just say, if I was a better salesperson 20 years ago, I probably could have sold a lot of security goods, but I much preferred to be truthful. So somewhat limited there. As a process check, we have several more questions. How long do you have to answer these?
Let me check with my...
Your schedule is, I would say another 10 minutes.
Yeah, so we got about 10 minutes, Beth.
Okay, I'll try and pick and choose here. One that's kind of interesting says that if we have difficulty trusting services in our critical infrastructure because of the way they've been coded or operated or other issues, perhaps we should back off from some of the higher tech approaches we have and go back to some of the means that are a little less vulnerable to cyber, more manual operation. Comments to that?
Yeah, I think anybody who's studied the Russian attacks on Ukraine will know that Ukraine actually got through some of their digital assaults on their electric grid because they did still have very manual processes and the ability, as well as the knowledge of people who could operate their networks or their grid manually. So it gave them a resilience and a robustness. The reality is that most of the U.S. sector has been engineered out for a lot of reasons. Some of it reliability. You can do some impressive things in the cyber environment that give you physical reliability against a host of other threats and natural issues that you would encounter, but it does introduce greater cyber risk. And so, I don't believe we get there in an economic sense. All of the forces that drive us let us walk backward to those physical redundancies and the non-cyber architectures, just because of cost efficiency, scope, and scale. But I do think we have to sit back and question the resilience and look at the totality of what makes something resilient, and a piece of that is the cyber resilience across it as well.
Thank you. Another one here. We know about the opportunities for research that are offered through NSF, NIST, DHS, but what kinds of partnerships and research are available through the more operational aspects of government, be it the NSA, Cybercom, or other participants in the IC or in law enforcement arena? Can you comment generally on that?
Yeah, so NSA does have allocations from the National Science Foundation and participates in grant giving. We also give grants to colleges and universities that are centers for academic excellence. So people that have a curriculum reviewed and meeting the standards of that program. So there are, I don't have, Tracy, do you have a good reference? I know on the NSA website, there is good links to our research directorate and places to connect for research grants. We do sponsor them in cybersecurity and cryptology, amongst other ideas. So I would just encourage you, sorry, I don't have a better answer to give you the specific process, but it's out there on our webpage.
That's fair.
Yep,
and
NSA.gov, yes.
Yes, NSA.gov. And I would also say out to the people who are interested in this, there are research opportunities also through some of the military research labs. There's also the IARPA as an organization has calls for research. So there is a robust system, but you have to investigate a little bit to find your way into it. I have a question here. You mentioned how you really want to stress the educational pipeline. Many undergraduates here at Purdue wish we could incorporate more techniques and practices that are actually out in industry and government, possibly having an internship or mentorship program for the students before they graduate. that whole idea for a national, not just here at Purdue, operation might be helpful. Do you have any comments on that generally? How could we teach differently? How could we incorporate that to better educate our students?
Yeah, I am enormously enamored with co-op education programs and internships. NSA has a really robust pipeline where you can be going to school and get both credit through a university co-op program and earn money, summer jobs, and get to test drive NSA. So it's a two-way street where we get exposed to young exceptional talent, and they get to see what NSA is like, because we don't get to talk about on the outside all of the things we're doing and all the cool ways you can contribute. So getting inside the fence line is just a huge opportunity. We invest in those internships and summer programs. I started here as a summer hire, more than 30 years ago, where they gave me a top secret SI clearance for a 3-month gig. A company will never do that. And then I had that as I was looking and talking to industry. I still chose to come back here because I could do and contribute things that just were not available anywhere else. So it was really awesome. The other thing we are a big investor in is there's a National Scholarship for Service program where the U.S. government pays for the last few years of your school, and you commit to a couple years with the government. And then, NSA is one of the leaders offering very technical, hands-on service paid positions after the graduation to close out that service. And so, again, it's an awesome place where you get to both see what we're doing operationally, find out if you're a good fit for those activities. And then on the other side of it, we see most people stay just because it's a pretty cool place to work.
We have a lot of graduates there, and at all levels, and not just people who've gone through their undergraduate, but even some of our PhD graduates have been there.
Absolutely.
We've run out of questions.
Spaff, while you gather the next question, I wanted to share, especially with any of the Purdue students who happen to be online, that we have on campus Eric Bryant, who works for Rob at the NSA, who is on campus looking to recruit interns and career opportunities at the NSA. He'll be giving a guest talk in Lawson, 1142 at 4:30 this afternoon. So if Mr. Joyce has given you some great interest in this possible career, come in here, his staff give you some more information later this afternoon.
Thank you, Joel. And Rob, thank you so much. We don't have any other open questions, and this is actually a good time to wrap up. Before you got here, I gave a little bit of introduction, mentioning how when I first met you over a decade ago, you were toiling in the trenches, as it were, but that you have done some very interesting things, and your comments really illustrated what I was saying about cyber being more than technology. It is really about its awareness, its communication, its understanding business case, politics. There's a lot that goes into being effective in this domain. You can be effective with just the technology, but we look to leaders who actually understand a broader scope, and you're certainly among the forefront of the group doing that. We're very grateful for the time you were able to spend with us, and continued best of luck with what you're doing.
Nope. Thanks so much, Beth. It's great to be here. You mentioned the Purdue graduates inside NSA. It is one of the foremost pipelines we look to. I think the legacy of Purdue and the types of education you give to the folks there producing that well-rounded individual you're talking about has been, just recognized here. And I think, the other point I'd make is we are always looking for diversity, right? I think that I talked about the hackers at NSA, the way we win against those foreign networks that are well designed, well defended, is that we put in the work to understand them better than the people who designed and defended them. And that brings an element of thinking differently. And we really value diversity because it brings those differences of thought and opportunity. So thanks again for hosting the conference. Thanks again for that pipeline of people that are being educated, whether they're coming to NSA, going to the government, or out into industry and academia. It's awesome work too. Thank you.